Welcome back to today's dialogue, and let's just continue on from where we left off. We were talking about Upsight, which is a word for a process and an ability created by Tom Matt, and also we were talking about Gaiaence, re-uncovery, and a little bit about Jesus as well. And also about the ideas of the good, the true, and the beautiful, or a world that is truthful, good, and beautiful. And during the break, I was making something to eat, and it came to me that re-uncovery is a way to catalyze the seed of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And if I were to translate the good, true, and beautiful into the terms that I've created in my process, it would be the good is Gaiosophy. So just like Gaiaence, you can create Gaiosophy or do Gaiosophy, which is philosophy but in direct contact with Gaia as one experiences it as themselves. And Gaiaence is like science, but that's the true. And the beautiful is something I haven't really talked about too much yet, which is, right now I call it quantum creativity. Because to me, in extraordinary state experiences, when mental models break down and there are other abilities coming in to try to take its place or maybe compete for space in one's consciousness and see which gift will win out in the end, it's a process of quantum creativity. And I think that re-uncovery is a way to, it's like a method, a Gaientific method to get to Gaiaence as well as Gaiosophy and quantum creativity. So in the example of Tom, I would say that he went right into quantum creativity without needing to do re-uncovery, because you don't have to do re-uncovery. Even if somebody might benefit from re-uncovering their gifts, they don't even have to do that. There's other ways, or they just might not bother. And I've also talked about how I think eventually the gifts leave a person alone. Sometimes they don't leave a person alone, and then that can lead to things like so-called madness, or say a diagnosis or something. And there's all different variations of this, but I just sort of saw how the process isn't something that human will initiates, but human will can resist it, and human will can also be used to some extent to will the gifts to come back, to know when to will and when not to. So, and also to use will. And if we think of this in terms of Jill Bolte Taylor's 4 characters, character 1 is the left-thinking mind. So, the left-thinking mind can be used in service of bringing these gifts back in, such as writing them down or keeping track of them, or watching educational content that extrapolates to the gift, that even though the educational content isn't specifically about a gift that humans have innately within themselves, the science or the philosophy around it helps to buffer and also build up that which we innately have within ourselves. So there's a lot to it. So I saw that, and then I was also thinking about how this example of Tom Matt could be used in people's minds to be like, well, I had a breakdown, I had a psychosis, and I didn't come out the other end immediately with a gift that stayed and, continued to play with me afterwards, and it's fun. So it's just never going to happen. That's just a rare thing. But I don't think that's true, and that's where I think re-uncovery can be really beneficial for people to, slowly but surely uncover these gifts. So, say for example, somebody reads like the book A Course in Miracles, and then they're like, oh, I'm going to do the 1-year program that they have where you do a lesson every day for a year. That's just a person deciding to explore consciousness or spirituality or religion in that particular way. And then re-uncovery would be like, I had these spiritual experiences. They were called mental illness, or maybe not. Re-uncovery is a way that each day or whenever I feel like it, I can learn from my own gifts. I can read my own Course in Miracles. I can read my own experience of miracles and start charting them out and having a dialogue about them and interacting with them in retrospect, which brings them into the moment, which allows them to move us into the future and bring those future consciousness traits into our present moment. And if you think about these parallel timelines I was talking about, where there is a parallel world where we never lost our gifts in the first place, and there's maybe a physical or a quantum manifestation of that possibility there. Like, we can literally dematerialize and rematerialize on that light template of our quantum possibility. That is maybe a way that we can move parallel worlds. Or, we can actually just sort of, through time, slowly step over to that reality by each time we're re-uncovering something, it's moving us over just one like small tiny step, maybe just like a plank length over towards our best possibility. Like, we can still get over there even if we've gone off track. And the thing is too, like, that is in the future, in that if we go about it slowly, stepwise, we will get there in the future, in quotes. But it's also there now. So there are possibilities where you can get there now. So in Tom's case, he would have jumped over to that possibility, from the possibility of remaining in a life of being addicted to drugs and whatever, and maybe having a shortened lifespan, to getting over to this possibility. And it was his gift that inspired him to get completely clean and sober in order to prove to himself and others that it's something that he can have access to when he's not on these substances. That path brought him the gift, but by removing the part of the path to get the gift, he still had the gift. Imagine if that was a path to gifts, like going on a bender. But it is for some people, apparently. So anyways, all that to say that I think in his example, it's great to see that there can be gifts from the state. There are gifts from the state. They can happen fast. But that's not to say that people, if their gifts don't happen fast, they can't harness them. They can, I think. And that's what I'm doing, and that's what I hope to create, something that other people can give themselves permission to begin to do, because without that, it's not going to begin, without that permission, which is like faith in one's gifts, which are the same kind of gifts, and then some, plus or minus some that Jesus had, if you want to say it that way. And that's what he said. So I think the little things I know of what Jesus said, or I have a sense of, that's all I need to know, because the rest is our life living as that. So, and also about Jesus, I actually had the insight that Jesus was normal. Jesus, with his experience of miracles, the way he saw the world, the way he lived, was actually normal. So the way we are living, because we didn't listen to and instantiate that consciousness within ourselves at the time, is actually pathological, right? So, and then he had this terrible experience of having to die. And, that's kind of what people have when they have a breakdown. They have this terrible experience where they feel like they're dying, at least. Maybe this is actually the gift that Jesus gives us, is we almost experience a near-death crucifixion like him, but we don't die. We resurrect and stay in this material reality, even though he didn't. He actually went on to wherever he went and wherever he is. So anyways, just different ways to think about it. And re-uncovery is methodical. It's a methodical way to get to one's sort of mystical gifts. It's a scientific method to the mystical, but it's an inner science, right? And it's for people who have gifts. And I'm seeing now, actually, that it could even be for people who are in these comments saying that they have these gifts and they're afraid of them. And they've never been pathologized, but they didn't want to look at the gifts, and they pretty much eventually hoped they would go away, and some of them did, because they thought they would be called crazy, right? And rightly so, I think. But at the same time, this whole process that's happening where we're denying these gifts and we don't have a method or a process to explore them or put them into play somewhere, somehow, which could be as small as just writing things down sometimes, that is a mistake. That's probably the original sin, right? We're not seeing things properly the way they are. And so, yeah, let's get on to other things. So let's go back to how Tom calls his ability Upsight vision. And he's, openly asking people if they also have Upsight vision, which, as we talked about, is seeing holograms of images and things and math and symbols and shapes and any number of things with one's conscious control outside one's head, not inside one's head. And I actually quite like the word Upsight, because a lot of times when I talk with myself and have a dialogue, I say I have an insight, and it's like a flash of light, and that's sort of how the channeling happens and receiving special messages and things that I write down or I say out loud. And insight, I use the word like Krishnamurti does, at least I think I do. But having a different word, Upsight, kind of helps, right? Because insight is from the inside. So it could actually be that I have insight, but it's more like I have outsight, because I see what's around and see patterns, and those movements speak to me in words without speaking. So it's quite strange. I don't know how it works. It's almost the total opposite of what Tom sees, and I've said that, but in a different way. Like, mine is total like nothing. It's like emptiness and what comes from that. And his is actually seeing things in space, out in space, out in the space around him. So I do like the word Upsight. And it made me wonder if, since my process is mostly more about insights that come in words, which again, don't have any sound, or I don't see them either, I was wondering if my words are upwards, right? Upwards. So I could say, well, I have upwards, right? Because they're words that sort of come from, you could say above, right? In a way. Not like they do come from above, but they're sort of above the level of the words that we tend to use. I think mostly words use us, but we can use words. And he talks a little bit about aliens and stuff, and I haven't had very many alien experiences myself, but when I see the pictures that they show of aliens with the big eyes and small mouths, it makes me think how aliens will be way more visual, and they probably won't speak. They have these small mouths and they don't speak, they say, right? So, humans speak, but it seems like with technology, if we go in the road of technology, we'll eventually stop speaking out loud. But there's another road where we keep speaking out loud, and maybe that's the part that I'm wanting to keep alive, within myself at least. So having these upwards, or, if we could really access language in this way, speaking and communicating would be really fun. Right now, it's not super fun the way it happens. So that's just a bit of an aside, but something that he became interested in was math. And he was talking about seeing and then deriving math equations that had already been discovered, things like that. And he went on to talk about Roger Penrose and how Penrose believed that this Platonic mathematical realm of forms are real, right? And he talks about that. And just to extrapolate, this isn't try to get deep into that because I don't know much about it. And in a way, it is sort of real in that you can come away with something that you can write on a piece of paper. So Tom sees this math stuff and he can eventually write it on a piece of paper. Now, I don't see or hear anything, but I can write words on a piece of paper from nowhere. Whereas he can write math on a piece of paper from somewhere. Now, Tom went on to talk about how, well, first of all, he said that Penrose seemed to allude to that there's something else also there that's real that isn't math. But since Penrose was a mathematician guy, he didn't really go there because he didn't want to reduce his validity in his field. So what that hinted to me was about how, yes, I see there's something else there. I can actually perceive language from life in a way that's not sound or vision. So it's an emptiness. There's a language in the fullness that comes through an emptiness, and you can put it on a piece of paper. So that's what I saw from there. And then Tom went on to talk about how his math, which he didn't explain a lot of, and I wouldn't understand anyway, he says a lot of his math applies to a point. Whereas a lot of math, I think it's supposed to be Cartesian, where it has coordinates in space and time. Again, I'm not an expert on this. But when he said that his math applies to a point, it made me think that perhaps his math points to language. So if there's an equation, which is, multiple terms for a point in space that he is seeing, for some reason I felt like there would be an equation for each letter of the alphabet, or an equation for different sentence structures. So what I was trying to see is that if math is indeed more fundamental in the underlying structure of reality, but it's not part of what most people, besides Tom and maybe a few people, see in reality. And then you think biblically again, you think, well, first there was the Word when the world was created. Well, this is the human world, right? Like the world of creation that humans experience, or like the earth, at least before humans were here, or whatever. So the Word is the point where our world is. And so if I'm seeing words, I just wonder if he's seeing something more fundamental underneath, that perhaps the equations actually are for language, like letters in different languages and different sentence structures and whatever. And I don't know, like, I'm just sharing that's something that came to me. Because, the other thing that I see with that is how, now with all the cryptocurrencies and everything, that, somehow a currency is tied to computers solving hash puzzles and whatever else they do. And that creates this currency that people are buying into and propping up the meaning of. And it's just based on some math, very complicated math. So I'm like, well, why? This is a bit of a different point than the last, but why is currency not tied to human words? Because, somebody speaking a sentence can change the course of the whole planet. Yet there's all this money currency being created from this math that no one's ever really going to see. Yet the language has more like visible and manifest effects. So why can't we tie human language into currency somehow? And I call that cryptic currency. I actually think the language that I see is cryptic currency. And I think just bringing it into reality has some kind of effect. I don't know. So yeah, I just see it again as like one of these really backwards, inversed things where we're coupling meaning that is meaningless to technology. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that per se, but we haven't seen how to do this other thing. Why isn't there a currency tied to solving language problems or problems of communication? And I guess there is in some way, because if people can communicate in certain ways, that creates businesses and economies and everything. But there is a more subtle thing that could be actually not subtle. So in the same way that maybe more people have Upsight and Tom is looking for them, more people probably have Gaiaence and upwards and channeling that, in communication there might be ways to work with some of these questions. Yeah, and so like words are equations, like they equate to things, they equate to gestures, they equate to patterns. So in a way, when I'm observing these perceptions, these gestures, this context, this Gaia, it's an equation, and there's some kind of equating happening to bring the weight of the meaning into my mind in words. So in a way, our brains are these quantum computers that can solve these upwards hash puzzles that are disguised in the reality that we see. They're not disguised. I think they're there. They're like a mimetic field that we can pick up on. But so yeah, I don't see language. If I talk about how I process things a little bit more, I don't see it. I sense it and I experience it. Like, language could actually be a sixth sense. So they talk about the sixth sense. I think there's probably 1,000 senses within the sixth sense. And then maybe you can just call it the sixth sense. But one of the sixth senses is language, and actually picking up on language from things around you. You know, and I think it could be, this is the way some of the indigenous cultures, they named things. Like, they looked at it and they heard it and they saw what the name was. And we're still able to do this to some extent, but we don't. We think language is a fixed thing. We don't see it as a living thing. And it's a living thing. It's actually part of life. And I think there are people who talk about this in linguistic stuff, but in the same way that Tom realized that he doesn't want to go back to school to study mathematics because, you know, then he would have the degree and be talking with the academics, but they would still be disagreeing. And instead he was just going to do his thing and do his process and see what happened with that. That's what I'm doing with mine. Like, I'm not an expert on the Bible. I'm not an expert on Roger Penrose. I'm not an expert on math. You know, I'm very much a generalist. I couldn't even be an expert if I wanted to because of how I don't remember things. And to me, that makes space for this other process. So there's a trade-off there. Like, when I listen to podcasts and I hear people quoting people and like they deeply studied someone, I probably have that with, I've studied quite a bit of J. Krishnamurti, but I was reading him before my brain started to rewire and metamorphose. Like, I can remember song lyrics from my childhood, but I can't remember new song lyrics to save my life. So anyways, so, you know, it seems like I can sense language as it's sort of written on my brain cells, and I write it down. And like I said, the benefit of having like a language ability or capacity rather than something like, say, math, is that, you know, we all speak a language for the most part, like our native language, but we don't all know math. So even if I don't think everyone is going to have this gift of math, but it's a very important one that I think can be co-creative with the language gift. But that more people might have the language gift and be able to unfold their gifts through using just their native language and self-dialogue. And so, yeah, I think, like I said, that the world might be born from math, but first there was the word, and that's from our perspective. It's the word, right? And